Many of you, especially students in the classroom, are probably familiar with some of his work, even if you don't know it. If you've ever been told the dangers of relying on weird participants, anybody? Some nods? Weird participants means Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Essentially, we had to come to terms with the fact that across behavioral sciences, we had a problem with over-relying on students, and students rely on a certain demographic. And so Dr. Norenzayan kind of led a major push to branch out and start to test different cultures, and that was incredibly influential across many fields of research. His research has been published in all of the big psychology journals, but also the big science journals, including Nature, and he's the author of the book, Big Gods, How Religion Transformed Cooperation and Conflict. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Dr. R. Norenzayan.
Thank you, Corey, for that generous introduction, and thanks for Tamara for this lovely invitation. I'm very excited to be here and to share some of my thoughts with you on the topic of polarization. Can you all hear me in the back? Okay, good. So I'm going to roam around, so let me know if there are any issues you can't hear me. Raise your hand, and I'll make adjustments. So this morning we heard a fascinating discussion from a panel from different disciplinary perspectives talking about polarization. And my topic is religion and polarization, and what does religion have to do with polarization. And so what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about my own thinking on this. Over the years, I have dabbled on this topic. It has never been the central focus of my research, but whenever you study religion, what the origins of religion and how does religion factor into human societies and human lives and cooperation, conflict comes up all the time, and you don't have to believe me on this, because you can open the newspaper every day and there is some topic on religion and conflict, right? So the question is, like, what is it about religion and conflict? Under what conditions and when does religion become a factor in human conflict and when it doesn't? So there's also a personal story in this for me. I grew up in Beirut in Lebanon in the 70s and the 80s, which was a time of quite strife. It was the time of the Lebanese Civil War, which had a religious dimension. The country was divided along Christian and Muslim sectors, and the country basically imploded, and people basically withdrew into their ethno-tribal communities. So this is something that I've experienced, and I've kind of thought about throughout my life. What happened? Why did it happen? Why is it that doesn't happen in other places, right? So why did it happen in Lebanon and in Northern Ireland and Bosnia, but why not in Canada or other places that are also diverse religiously? Or the United States, for that matter. Despite the polarization here, people are still, doing well by my standards. Okay, so I'm going to start with telling you a little bit about what I want to say, the main points of my talk. So first, I'm going to talk about the expanding circle of cooperation. So I'm going to start with the opposite of polarization. I'm going to start with the point that we human beings are actually remarkably talented and good at expanding the circle of cooperation. And only understanding that will help us understand why polarization is a problem. Then we'll talk about religious diversity and the expansion of the cooperative circle. So this is the question of, are there anything in religious beliefs, practices, experiences that may have been a contributing factor to the expansion of the social circle? Then we're going to move on to the question of polarization and division. So I'm going to talk about 3 different lines of research that I've done where I've tried to answer this question. One is about the connection between religion and support for violent extremism. The other one is about moral distrust of atheists. The third one is on religious cooperation with in-groups and out-groups. To what extent religious cooperation extends to out-groups is the question here, excuse me. And then I'm going to conclude with the 3 challenges that I think religions of the world are facing today in the 21st century. Okay. And hopefully I'm going to do this in 45 minutes. Let's start with the expanding circle. So since since agriculture, since the time when human beings stopped being hunter-gatherers and started to settle into small villages and towns, so we're talking about the last 12,000 years of human history, the human circle of cooperation has been expanding. This is a remarkable story. It's an incredible story, and it's a puzzle. It's a puzzle because two things. One is that no other species can do this. We don't know of any other species where people have expanded their circle of cooperation among more and more individuals when these individuals are not genetically related. So for example, social insects can have colonies, but they're all related. So that's not a puzzle from the evolutionary point of view. But we don't only expand our circle to our kin and our family, we expand our circles to complete strangers. We live in cities of millions of people, right? We live in global communities. So here is basically a bit of a diagram of what we've done over the time, over these thousands of years. So the first puzzle is no other species does it. The second puzzle is that we don't have the temperament. Psychologically, we're not equipped to do this. Our psychology is calibrated to live in small hunter-gatherer bands, which is the vast majority of human evolution. Our brains were designed to live in small, transparent communities of maybe 100 people, 50 to 100 people. And there is not a whole lot of evidence that psychology has changed that much over the last 10,000 years. So how can we take this kind of a psychology or a mindset, put it in global communities and do it? And we're doing it all the time, right? And this circle has been expanding. We're at the point where now we even discuss, for example, can we expand the social circle not only to our community, our local community, our co-ethnics, our co-religionists, which can also span the entire world for some religions, world religions. Can we expand it to all of humanity? Can we think of us human beings as a community, right? And we're vigorously discussing this topic, and many people think that we can do it and should do it. Can we expand it further to all living things, to all nature, right? So this is the argument that I'm sure you've heard of. Peter Singer, the philosopher Peter Singer, has made this argument already. Okay. Let me see if I'm too far, maybe. Okay. Oops. What happened here? Okay. So if I could summarize in one sentence this accomplishment of the last 12,000 years, we could say is that our capacity to cooperate as human beings is more than what evolution required. From the evolutionary psychology point of view, we should have been able to do this, yet we're doing it all the time. And let me just flesh out very quickly the evolutionary logic of what I just said. From an evolutionary point of view, there are two mechanisms of cooperation that work really well and it's very well studied, very well understood. It works in humans, it works in other species. One is reciprocal altruism, the other one is kin selection, or kin altruism. Reciprocal altruism is basically if you can get two individuals who know each other well, and they can monitor each other's behavior, and they have good memory to remember what that person did, and they can reciprocate. If the reciprocation is mutual, then you get a nice cooperative dyad going, right? This is the basic psychology of friendships and allyship, right? If someone invites you for dinner, you invite them back to dinner, but if they stop inviting you for dinner, you at some point say, I don't want to do it anymore. But as long as the cooperation is reciprocal, it can stabilize. It becomes a stable, reciprocal, cooperative act. This explains how limited cooperation among dyads can work. The second way that cooperation can emerge is among kin, among genetically related individuals. Sometimes this is also called inclusive fitness, where we have a genetic interest to help and cooperate with people who share ancestry with, close family members. The closer the family member, the stronger this tendency is. No puzzle here, there's no mystery. This happens across species. But neither of these mechanisms can explain an expanding circle of cooperation among strangers who are interacting with each other in an ephemeral way. You might interact with someone, you may never meet them again, but you're still nice and friendly with them. Why? It doesn't make sense. We don't have that psychology, right? But yet we're doing it. So what's going on? So here is one possible partial answer to this puzzle that brings us back to religion. This is a picture of Göbekli Tepe. It's the world's oldest known temple that has ever been excavated by archaeologists. It's about 11,500 years old. It's in southern Turkey near the Syrian border, which is basically a war zone now. I have not visited this place, although I didn't grow up far from it. But people have visited this place. They say it's a really fascinating place. I won't get into too much detail about it, but what's really interesting about it is that it has monumental architecture, and there is clear evidence of its date. The date is, as I said, goes way back before agriculture. So there has been no evidence found of any agriculture that predates this site. So hunter-gatherers came together from all over Anatolia and did whatever they did. They worshipped and did rituals. So it was a gathering place. And that might have led to also some settlements in that area, which then led to agriculture. So that's one interesting possible way by which religious rituals might have contributed to the expansion of the social circle, at least initially. How would have this happened? And this is something that was a topic of a book I wrote that Corey mentioned. The idea here is that when you have a growing circle of people who are unrelated individuals who come together, one way they can cooperate with each other is if they sincerely believe that there is someone watching over them and monitoring their behavior and rewards and punishes certain kinds of acts. So even if no one's watching, if a deity is watching, if the deity cares about morality and punishes norm violations, then these people might start cooperating. And in fact, this is exactly the kind of deities and forces that many of the world's religions followers believe in, despite the fact that these kinds of moralizing gods and forces are infrequent in the ethnographic record. So if you look at the world map by religion, you can see that the overwhelming majority of the world are followers of either the Abrahamic religions or the Dharmic religions. So the Abrahamic religions, you have Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and their offshoots. Then you have on the east, you have the Buddhism and Hinduism, and their offshoots. Together, they comprise an overwhelming majority of believers in the world. If you look at folk religions that are not related to these traditions, they're like 5% of the world. The rest is Abrahamic or Dharmic. So how did this happen? This is also a puzzle. How is it that these kinds of beliefs and traditions spread so successfully all over the world and became world religions? And I'm not going to get into too much detail, but in a nutshell, this is the kind of idea that I propose in Big Gods, in the book, where I said, well, maybe certain kinds of beliefs, like moralizing gods or moralizing forces like karma, which also serves in a similar way to keep track of moral behavior and has rewarding and punishing capacities. If these kinds of rituals might work in the same way, where people come together and do rituals together, that might also bind people together as moral communities, even though they're strangers. That would lead to the expansion of cooperation to more and more people, including complete strangers. They become moral communities. With the expansion of cooperation, you have larger groups, which is what has been happening in human history. And with larger groups, these beliefs and rituals spread, leading to where we are today. Fast forward to 12,000 years, we have these world religions, and we have large-scale cooperation. So this was basically the idea in The Gods that I wrote back in 2013. It's 300 pages. I heard that some of you might be reading it, but I know it's too long. So if you don't want to read it, there's a shorter version by a Canadian comedian / rapper called Baba Brinkman, who did a one-man show on Broadway. I'm not making this up. And he describes, where he basically summarizes this by this theme. And he calls it Canadian hip-hop with an intellectual bent, nothing but sexy beats and sumptuous brain food. So you can get through this in 5 minutes. Okay, back to the how did this happen? Of course, I don't think that religion is the only way this happened. In fact, there are many solutions to the problem of large-scale cooperation, and many researchers have been working on this problem. So, for example, policing institutions could also contribute to large-scale cooperation. So if societies develop police forces, which then monitor people and intervene to punish people who are deviating from norms, like committing murder or stealing or treating other people unfairly, with enough presence of that kind of third-party punishment, as it's called, which is policing, then you get these societies to be more cooperative. There are cultural norms. Societies sometimes develop cultural norms to socialize children to be nice to strangers, to cooperative with strangers, right? We do that all the time in our societies. Extended empathy and compassion towards people who are not necessarily related to us, right? Even though naturally it feels, empathy and compassion is most naturally felt among families and maybe close friends, but we can extend it. We are a very creative species, and we can also feel empathy towards someone who is suffering or someone who is at a disadvantage, even though they're complete strangers, and that could also contribute to this, etc. So there are many other things going on. Some argue that markets, trading, right? If you're trading with a neighboring tribe, you don't want to go and attack them, right? Because you're benefiting from them and they're benefiting from you. So trading and markets can also contribute to cooperative behavior across divides, etc., rituals, moralizing gods. So I wanted to make clear that I think that certain religious beliefs and practices are part of this big, larger puzzle. It's by no means they're the only explanation, which is something that some people have thought about what I said in the book, which is not what I think. So as a result, I revised the title of my book. And you remember in the 19th century, there were these Victorian titles. They were like abstracts, right? They would give you like the entire details of what the book is about. So this is the 19th century Victorian title of my book, which the publisher rejected. They said, this is not going to sell, stick with big gods. I said, okay. But this is the real title. Okay, now I'm going to walk you through some evidence for what I just described to you. I'm not going to get into too much detail in the interest of time, but just to give you a sense of how researchers interested in this question would try to address answer these questions. And then we'll talk about religious divides and polarization. So how do we know that something like this might have happened? Well, I'm going to show you 3 lines of evidence. One is ethnographic. So if this line of reasoning is correct, if moralizing gods or belief in moralizing gods and forces contributed to the expansion of the moral circle, then we should expect that in larger communities, in places where the societal scale is larger and more complex, you should expect more higher prevalence of moralizing gods, right? If this was not the case, the whole argument collapses. This has to be true, unless if it wasn't true, then there's not much of an argument. So this is, and there are many studies now that have looked at this looking at the ethnographic record. This is something called a jurisdictional hierarchy. On the horizontal axis is the size or the scale of a society. On the left side is communities. This is the simplest, smallest kind of societal structure. These are basically foraging bands, hunter-gatherers, where there is no structure, much of a structure. There's no hierarchy. They're egalitarian bands. There are about 50 to 100 to 150 people who live together at any given point in time. On the extreme right of this graph are large states and large states. That's basically the kinds of societies most people live in today, like US, Canada, but even a small country would be a large state. and then everything in between. But as you can see, clearly, the larger the scale of a society, the more complexity there is, the more people, the more likely they have a moralizing God or gods. It doesn't have to be one God, by the way. It can be also a multitude of gods. So, for example, Hinduism has many gods that are moralizing, but that's fine. The argument doesn't hinge on being one God. There are other studies like that have basically confirmed this pattern, also looking at other variables and controlling for them. So that seems to be working. So now we know that moralizing gods are more prevalent in in larger scale societies. The question then is, did that happen because of the cooperative effect of this belief in moralizing gods? And here, notice that to be able to answer that question, is it the case that people who are committed to a moralizing deity are more likely to cooperate with strangers who are of the same religion as they are? Okay, that's the next question. And to answer that question, we need to look at variability of what people believe about their gods. Corey mentioned the weird problem, and here the weird problem kind of comes back, because if we want to answer this question in our society, we cannot do it because everybody believes in a moralizing God, right? If we ask believers in the United States to describe their God, they say that God knows everything, God is completely benevolent, has punishing capacities, and is morally concerned about everything, right? So they're maxed out on this dimension. So we can't do a study. But if you go worldwide, you find a lot of variability. There are lots of places where people, for example, one of our field researchers, anthropologist Ben Perzicki, went to Siberia and studied Siberian shamans who practice a mixture of Buddhism and shamanic beliefs. And there are these spirit masters called Cherizi who have kind of intermediate kind of abilities. So they know some things, but not everything. So they might know what's going on around them in the village, but if you go further away, they might not know what's going on. Same in Fiji, for example. In Fiji, there are some powerful spirits who might know what people are like and what they're doing, but if you hop to another island, those spirits don't know what you're doing in the other island, right? So there's intermediate and limited capacities. So what we did is we went around the world working with a variety of ethnographers and anthropologists and psychologists, and we captured a lot of human diversity this way of religious beliefs. We measured people's beliefs. So this is where we went in the first wave of the study. We had close to 600 participants overall. We had almost 35,400 observations, so this was a decent sample size and number of data to work with. We measured people's beliefs about their deities, and we gave them a cooperative game to see if their beliefs would help us understand their tendency to be fair with co-religionists who are complete strangers to them, who they've never met. So the game that we had them to play, so this is one thing that we social psychologists and some economists do it too. You need a way of getting to measure how people cooperate, right? And we want to make the cooperation real. We don't want to just ask people, hey, are you cooperative? Because people may not know how cooperative they are, or they might exaggerate how cooperative they are. So we actually get actual behavior with actual stakes. So we actually had monetary consequences for people. So we give people, in this case, this is in the random allocation game, people were given a die and a set of coins, and they had to, ahead of time, they decide if a die comes in a certain number or a color, they would put the coin in one cup or another cup, so they had two cups to work with. This was happening in isolation, in anonymity, so nobody saw what they were doing. And they played two different games. There's the self, in the self game, they could allocate the money to themselves, or to a distant co-religionist. A distant co-religionist was basically someone of the same religion as they were, but someone who lived in a different village or a different place. They would never meet this person. So it's a complete stranger, okay? And in the local co-religious game, the two options were a local co-religionist, someone of their own village, or a distant co-religionist. So basically, they're throwing a die, and then they're allocating the coins. The die is fair. So if people are playing fairly, what should happen? Over a long trial, half and half, right? That you would expect basically a binary distribution where half of the time the coins would be in one cup, half of the time it should be in another cup. For each game, people played it this 30 times. Okay? Then we looked at deviations. Did people deviate from this pattern? And there was some deviation. Then the question was, did this deviation, was this deviation explained by what people think about their gods? And it was. So what we found was, oops, sorry. What happened here? Sorry about that. Okay. So what you see here was that when people, the more people thought that their God was moralistic and punishing, the more they favored the distant co-religionist. Okay? So they deviated towards the distant co-religionist at the expense of the self, in the self game, and at the expense of the local co-religionists in the second game. Omniscience had a similar effect. The more people thought that God was omniscient, knows everything, the more likely they again favored the distant co-religionists. So this is again evidence that there is some cooperative effect of these beliefs, and which might help us explain this expansion of cooperation. Okay? And we had a number of controls there. You don't have to worry too much about it, but we wanted to make sure that this finding is stable and robust to a variety of other factors. We also ran a second wave of a study of the same sort. We added a different game called a Dictator game. I won't go into it. We expanded our sample size, our field. We had many more fields, and we basically replicated the effect, which was reassuring. We also added one more thing, and I'm not going to talk about it here because we got inconclusive results, but I'm going to get back to this really important question of religious in-groups and out-groups, because in this study, we added, people also played with a religious out-group member. And we want to see how much people will cooperate and whether or not believing in a moralizing God will predict cooperation with an out-group. And we got really inconclusive results. There was a lot of variability in what people did, so we couldn't say in any conclusive way whether or not that was the case. So I'm going to skip that, but I'm going to come back to that question in a few minutes, trying a different approach, different methodology. Okay, the third kind of evidence that I want to talk about, and I'm giving you highlights of this evidence. There's a lot more to this and there's a lot of more detail and many more studies. But in the interest of time, I'm just giving you kind of a feel for what kind of studies we do to address these questions. So far we have correlational evidence. We have evidence that ethnographically in more socially complex societies, there are more moralizing gods, belief in moralizing gods. We know that the more across the world, the more people believe that their deities punish and know and are morally concerned, the more likely they're willing to cooperate or treat fairly a distant co-religionist. Now I'm going to show you some experimental evidence where in places where people already have a moralizing God, if we remind them of that moralizing God, would they treat a stranger more impartially? So this is a study by my graduate student Sindel White and John Michael Kelly and Azim Sharif, who's a colleague of mine at the University of British Columbia, when we use in this case, what's called a Dictator game, where people are given a certain amount of money, and then they are basically, they have to choose how much of this money they want to keep to themselves or to share it with a stranger. Okay? In this study, the particular study I'm showing you, participants this is how it worked. Participants in round one were basically given 3 opportunities to play this game. And they got different amounts in different opportunities. So imagine if you're a participant in the study, you would get 30 cents and say, how much of this you want to keep to yourself? How much of it you want to share with this anonymous stranger you've never met and you will never meet? And whatever people decided, we actually did it. We shared it with an anonymous stranger who was a different participant in the same study. They did this three times, and then we said, okay, now I would like you to play a new round of the same game, but now we would like you to do this from the perspective of God for people who are believers. Or we said, play this game from the perspective of karma for people who believe in karma. Because karma is also a supernatural moralizing force. And then there was a neutral condition as well, where we didn't give any instructions. The believers of God were Christians. For the karma believers, they were Hindus and Buddhists. And here are the results. When people played the game just from their own perspective, you can see that they shared a little bit, but not a whole lot. Those are the light blue bars. When we said, okay, play this game with the way that you want God wants you to play, or the way karma wants you to play, we had slightly different instructions in different studies, but it didn't matter. All of a sudden, people gave more. Okay? And it turned out that actually what was happening, I won't show you the details of the data, but what was happening was that people were most likely to shift when thinking about God or karma when they were initially selfish. They were acting selfishly. They were close to not sharing at all. But all of a sudden, they were like, oh, what God wants me to do, what karma wants me to do. And they started sharing fairly. They split the money in half. So it was a shift from selfishness to fairness. And you can see that it didn't matter what denomination people were, the effect size is roughly the same. And we also, in other studies, found that if you give this instruction to non-believers, they don't do anything. So you have to have the belief. You have to have the belief to be able to respond to this kind of instructions. This is also some evidence that these beliefs are having cooperative effects. Okay, so that was the first part of the talk, where we kind of set the stage for how some religious beliefs and practices might have contributed to the expansion of the cooperative circle. But what about the other side of the coin? What about religious conflict? What about religious divides? Which is what we are here for to think about. When does religion turn toxic? Why is it that sometimes, religion seems to be many peace activists in the world are, come from a point of view of religion, like Mahatma Gandhi or Dalai Lama or Desmond Tutu, but at the same time we see a lot of religious conflict. So there's a picture of the Crusades there. On the right panel, those are minority Christians in Pakistan protesting against violence against Christians. On the left, you have violence against Muslims in India, and on the very bottom, on the left, is a picture of religious violence against Muslims by Buddhists in Burma. So it seems like religiously motivated conflict is quite widespread, and it's not unique to any particular religion, right? Even sometimes people think of Buddhism as the religion of peace, and it's like that's the only one religion where doesn't have a history of conflict. That's not true, actually. Buddhism also has a long history of conflict, and we're seeing it today with the Rohingya community, the persecution of the Rohingya community. Okay, and this brings us to Allport's paradox. I'm a social psychologist. Gordon Allport was one of the founders of social psychology, and he was very interested in religion back in the 50s. He said, religion makes prejudice and unmakes prejudice. The sublimity of religious ideals is offset by the horrors of persecution in the name of the same ideals. So I call this the Allport's paradox. How is it that religion can, build community, expand cooperation, but at the same time be an accessory to conflict? And there's a lot of strong opinions on this topic. I don't have to tell you, you know already. So on one extreme, you have someone like Richard Dawkins who says, religious faith deserves a chapter to itself in the annals of war technology, and even footing with the longbow, the war horse, the tank, and the hydrogen bomb, right? So So basically, Richard Dawkins thinks religion is a war technology. That's it, right? On the other hand, you have someone like Dalai Lama who says religion is a remedy to help reduce the conflict and suffering in the world, not another source of conflict. I could have replaced many other religious leaders here who would have said something similar. So the problem for us researchers to try to get at this question is that it's a very hotly debated topic. People have very strong opinions. Also, people cherry pick their examples, right? So if you ask Richard Dawkins, he would point to the Crusades or to Al-Qaeda. And if you ask someone who disagrees with that, they would find different examples where religion is not a conflict. Or they would say, hey, we'll look at all these secular sources of ideologies that are also contributing to conflict, right? Like communism and other kinds of isms, nationalism, that have been also a big source of conflict. So what do we do? So there is this one study that I really like, actually, and it's not a peer-reviewed academic study, but actually it did a really good job of trying to give us a sense of what is the state of affairs. If you look at all the violent conflicts in a certain period of time, in this case 3,500 years, and then you just count the number of conflicts and then look at the role of religion in these conflicts, what would you find? So the BBC commissioned this study and asked historians to pore over hundreds of conflicts over a 3,500 years period. And they looked at things like, was religion a mobilizing factor? Was conversion a goal? Did religious leaders support the conflict or violent conflict or the war? Were religious targets attacked? So these are the kinds of things that they looked at. Quite reasonable, features of religion being implicated in conflict. And then they basically rated each war on a scale of 0 to 5. So as you can see on the right panel, the Peloponnesian War, that's the famous war between Athens and Sparta, got a 0. There was no religious dimension to it at all. On the other hand, Al-Qaeda, the recent Al-Qaeda violence, got a 4 out of 0 to 5, and the Crusades got a 5, right? And you can plug in, your favorite conflict there in between. So then the question was, what percentage of the time the religion was a factor at all? What would you guess? 0%, 5%, 10%, 20%, 100%? Dawkins would say 100%, right? So that tells you a little bit about what you think about this topic, right? It was 40%. But rarely ever a war got 4 or 5. The typical thing was in this 40%, 1 or 2 or 3. Okay? So it looks like the typical pattern in human history is religion gets kind of entangled in conflict. Once there is conflict, some people know how to take the mobilizing forces of religion to feed into the conflict, as opposed to like the purpose of the war is religious, like the Crusades, right? Or the Islamic conquest of the early 7th century is another example. Okay, so this gives us a bit of a bearing on this issue. It seems like, okay, like 40% is not trivial, but it's not 100%, right? And so we still need to understand this 40%. Okay, so this brings me to the three different ways that I think that religion might be a factor, and this helps us also understand how religion can do the opposite and overcome these conflicts. So the first one is the groupishness of religious solidarity. So remember that religion is, at least some religious traditions or constellation of beliefs and practices can be a powerful source of community. But if this community becomes very tribal, it's very circumscribed, it excludes people from, that are not supposed to be members of this community, then that could open up the possibility for intolerance and conflict. Sometimes we call this parochial prosociality. So there are people who are being very prosocial towards their own community, but they're also intolerant and unwilling to expand the social circle, right? They mark very strong boundaries around their communities. So this is not surprising because our brains, our minds are tribal minds. You know, that's what we're working with. You know, we started with that puzzle, right? How is it that we can expand the social circle despite the fact that we have tribal minds, right? That's the interesting question. So religious beliefs and practices have to work with this as well. So in one line of research, we looked at, this is work with Jeremy Ginges, social psychologist, colleague of mine, a longtime collaborator, and a former graduate student in Hansen, where we wondered whether or not maybe one way when that religion gets entangled in conflict is when we look at belief versus ritual as two different things about religion. So what we did is, and we wanted to get at the real life religious conflict and extremism. And so we looked at support for suicide attacks among Palestinians as one study, and then I'm going to show you next support for violence against Palestinians among Israeli Jewish settlers, and I'm going to show you an international sample. In all these cases, we looked at the same thing. So what we did is, in this study, we had a representative Palestinian sample in the West Bank. We asked the Palestinian sample, how much do you support someone like this guy? On the right panel, you see Muhammad Shaldan, who was described as a martyr in his sacrificing himself, etc. He was actually a suicide bomber who killed 3 Israeli soldiers back in 2002. So the question that the critical question we asked our sample was, do you support martyrdom attacks like this one? Okay? And then we measured a variety of other things. The 2 critical things that we looked at was frequency of mosque attendance and frequency of prayer. We did ask belief in God, although that was unhelpful because we maxed out. Everybody believed in God. On a scale of 1 to 10, it was 10. So once there's no variability, you can't really do anything. It's not a predictor variable. But there was variability on mosque attendance, and there was variability on prayer frequency. So our measure of ritual was mosque attendance. Our measure of belief was, at least commitment to belief, was prayer frequency. And we had a bunch of control variables. We want to make sure that whatever we find is not due to gender, different age, economic satisfaction. We even looked at support for the Oslo process because it was going on. The Oslo process is completely dead, but at the time it wasn't dead. So controlling for how much people think peace is possible, right? And support for Sharia. And what we found was regular attendees of mosque were more likely to support these kinds of martyrdom attacks, controlling for all these other variables. But frequency of prayer was unrelated. You pray more, you pray less, had nothing to do with how much you support these kinds of what Palestinians call martyrdom attacks, and people outside, the rest of us, we call suicide bombings, right? So prayer frequency was unrelated, but mosque attendance was related. It increased the odds of supporting martyrdom attacks by almost 2 times. Okay. Next, we wondered, is this something unique to the Palestinian case? Or is it something more broader, more general? So in the next study, we actually sampled Orthodox Jewish settlers in the West Bank. And we wanted to find something that is a close equivalent to a suicide attack. Because Jews don't do suicide attacks against Palestinians because they have tanks. But there was this interesting case of Baruch Goldstein who once walked into a mosque and then started shooting people. And then he was overcome and killed. So it's the closest thing to something like a martyrdom attack. That's what Palestinians call it. And in fact, on his tomb, something like that is described. And there he has supporters. A certain percentage of West Bank Jewish settlers consider him a hero, although many of them don't and disagree. So there's also variability in both groups. So what we did in this study is we asked, do you agree that Goldstein's act was heroic? And did an experimental manipulation here where before we asked this question, do you agree with this act is heroic, we reminded people of their, we asked people, think about the last time you prayed. So there was a reminder of prayer. Or we said, think about last time you went to synagogue. And then we asked the question about, do you think this act was heroic? And what we found was, compared to not saying anything, when we reminded people of synagogue attendance, that increased support for this act, whereas prayer reminder, if anything, decreased this tendency to support this act. So, analogous to the Palestinian finding. Then we wondered, is this a more general pattern? Does it work in other religious traditions as well? So we found actually an interesting data set. Data was done by the BBC. It was a survey which we used for our purposes, where there were 2 questions asked in worldwide in I believe it was 7 or so countries. We had over 4,700 participants with a lot of variability in their demographic backgrounds. And we found 2 items where we thought was a close approximation to what we were calling parochial altruism or support for extremism or violent extremism that's religiously motivated. And the 2 items were, I am willing to die for my God or my beliefs. And the other one was, I blame other religions for the problems of the world. So do you agree with both? Kind of says something about this mindset of like, I think that other religions are a problem, and I'm willing to die for my belief, right? This kind of comes close to this kind of mindset. And then we also measured, or they had measured attendance levels, and they had measured prayer frequency. And we have these religious majorities in 6 countries, not 7, excuse me. We have a variety of traditions here: Catholic, Protestant, Muslim in Indonesia. We have Hindus, Jewish in Israel, Orthodox, and the full sample. And again, the overall pattern of results was largely consistent with what we found before. It was remarkable. Attendance seemed to increase the odds of supporting this kind of a mentality, but prayer didn't. And sometimes it went in the opposite direction, although in a mild way, not in a very strong way. Now I want to, so this generally says that there's something about attendance and ritual that seems to bind people together in a way that might be also a dividing factor, right? And prayer doesn't seem to have that kind of a factor. This reminds me of the famous psychologist William James, who kind of presciently 100 years ago said something like this. He said, the thing with religion is that it gets entangled with dogmatism and other things that seem to be, then a source of intolerance. I also want to emphasize here is that I don't necessarily think that religious attendance and rituals are always have this effect. In fact, there are some newer studies that show that certain kinds of rituals, if they're done in a way that is more expansive, that can have the opposite effect. So in places or contexts where people are performing rituals or attending services where there's a lot of diversity and there's a lot of inclusion, as opposed to this one thing in your own little community, then that could also have more effects that are more expansive and more tolerant. So this is still work in progress. We still have to figure out exactly what's going on. Okay, next thing that I have done over the years, try to understand religion and religious divides, is this idea of believing in belief. This idea that believers think that having belief is a marker of morality, and so if you're not committed to a belief, then you're outside of the moral scope of things. So this is basically the idea of moral distrust of atheists that Corey mentioned in his talk in the morning, because he's done some work on this as well. And so I'm going to briefly show you some data on moral distrust of atheists as another factor in divides and polarization. Now, it's kind of a puzzle. So basically, we're talking about distrust of atheists, and it's a bit of a puzzling thing, because if you think about it, why would people, if you're a believer, why would you have moral distrust of atheists? Because as Ricky Gervais says, it's not like people, atheists or non-believers, they don't really have a worldview. It's not, except for a very small vocal minority, they just don't care about religion. They're just apatheists, as we call them, right? They're not atheists, they're apatheists. And Ricky Gervais says it very nicely. He says it's like atheism is a worldview, like not skiing is a hobby, right? So the other interesting thing is that the numbers of non-believers is very large. The world is about 12 to 15% non-believers. If these non-believers would come together and form a global community, which they don't, but if they did, they would be the third religion in the world, right? Right behind Christianity and Islam. That's huge. That is huge. But they're just scattered and they don't care. So why would you have this kind of distrust? But this distrust goes way back into history. So who can guess where is this quote from? This is the idea that free thinkers are free riders, right? So, which is what I'm getting at in terms of an explanation. So the quote says, "Those are not at all to be tolerated who deny the being of a God. Promises, covenants, and oaths, which are the bonds of human society, can have no hold upon an atheist. The taking away of God, though but even in thought, dissolves all." So this quote is saying, if you don't believe in God, I can't consider you a moral person. I can't cooperate with you. You're outside of the moral community. Anyone can guess where this comes from? John Locke, Letter Concerning Toleration. So this is one of the foundational documents of Western civilization that established the idea of religious tolerance. But Locke said, well, up to a point, we can tolerate other religious groups, but not atheists. Atheists just cannot be tolerated. And this idea is a very strong, compelling idea around the world. This is a survey of where basically, I think this was Gallup asking, is it important to believe in God to be a moral person? Is believing God necessary for morality? And you can see here where countries stand on this issue. There's very high percentages of the world believe in this, although there is a lot of variability. Interestingly, a lot of this variability is explained by wealth. So wealthier countries are less likely to have this commitment, although I don't think necessarily it's wealth. I'm going to get to that in a second, but something about wealth. So places like, the weird countries don't have this belief, except for the United States. The US is an outlier, as you can see. I circled it for you. Where it's a wealthy country, has strong institutions. It should be much lower on this than it is. Still US is a very religious place. So US is more like North Korea and Tunisia and Lebanon and South Africa, etc. on this scale. I think that this is really about institutions, and the wealthier places have stronger institutions. Again, US is an interesting outlier on this, but we'll come back in a second. So we've done a number of studies on this. A lot of it was led by Will Gervais, not Ricky Gervais. Will Gervais was my former graduate student. It's just pure coincidence that they have shared the same last name, and they seem to think about similar things. And what we have found in several studies, and Corey has found similar patterns in his studies, is that we found a strong association with believing in God and this kind of distrust of atheism, and no matter how we measured it, we got the same pattern. And we also found, at least in one study, that this tendency, this connection between believing in God and distrusting atheists was mediated. The key factor was belief in supernatural monitoring, belief in something like people behave better when they feel that God is monitoring their behavior, right? And this kind of makes sense from the logic of what I described to you, right? If that is the sort of the crux of religiously motivated cooperation, what do you do when you encounter someone who says, I'm not under supernatural monitoring, I don't believe in God? Then it's really hard to trust that person, right? Unless there's some other reason to trust that person. But before I get to that, I also want to mention a study by Will Gervais and his colleagues that came out recently. So until this study came out, I was convinced that this distrust of atheists was really driven by religious belief. If you're not a religious person, you wouldn't distrust atheists. But in this study, this global study of many countries, they found that religiosity didn't really matter that much. They found, and this was implicit distrust of atheists, not explicit, so that might be the reason here. So don't worry too much about what the predicted error rate means. It was just a way of measuring people's unconscious way of thinking about atheists as being trustworthy or not trustworthy. And the bigger the target, so the atheist target versus religious target, basically denotes distrust of atheists. And you see a big gap. The gap narrows a little bit as you get to UK, Netherlands, UK, but even like Netherlands is a very irreligious country. The vast majority of Dutch are non-believers. Same with the UK. And still there you're getting this gap, right? The gap is significant statistically, although it's smaller. The only place where they didn't find this gap was Finland. Everywhere else there was this gap. So this is an interesting finding that also, makes me think more about is it possible that there are a lot of non-believers who themselves are distrustful of atheists, right? And why would that be? And finally, there's some good news on this, which is that believers don't always distrust atheists. Actually, if you think about the logic of supernatural monitoring, if the underlying factor is that I don't want to cooperate with an atheist because I don't think they're morally trustworthy, they're moral wildcards, what about if you think about the fact that, well, there are other reasons why people can be moral. There are other reasons why people can cooperate. And the other reason might be, for example, strong institutions. And here what we did is we looked at distrust of atheists, that's on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis is government effectiveness. How effective governments are. So less corruption, stronger institutions, people saying, I trust the government, I trust institutions. So a combination of these variables. And what you can see is the stronger the government effectiveness of a country, the less there is distrust of atheists. This is also true for religious people. In fact, that's why this is interesting. So you can take two religious people in two different countries. In one place, there is strong government effectiveness. In another place, the government effectiveness is weak. Equally religious people, in the place where there's strong effectiveness of government, they're going to be much less distrusting of atheists than in the country where there is weak institutions. So this also tells you that there's this interesting hydraulic, so to speak, relationship between government and God, right? So when people feel like, well, I mean, this person doesn't believe in God, but they really are, we're living in a place where there's a lot of trust. We're living in a place where there's a lot, government is something you can trust, then people are less reliant on this intuition to treat people who are not believers. Finally, back to cooperation. So that was the distrust of atheist part. Most recently, I've kind of gotten back to this question about religious divides, coming back to the question of cooperation and cooperation with strangers, and trying to understand how much of this cooperative effect of religious belief extends to outgroups. is there any evidence that the circle of cooperation can go beyond the religious in-group? Because remember, in the previous studies I showed you on cooperation, people were being fair to strangers who were of the same religion as they were, right? But what about if someone is of a different religion than you are? So this is a study that is still ongoing, and we just finished collecting data. It's a collaboration with Jeremy Ginges and Mickey Pasek, Crystal Shackelford, John Michael Kelly, and Alan Vishkin, along with Sinil White, John Michael Kelly, and Azim Sharif. You've seen a version of this already. I just want to walk you through very quickly about this new version of the study with in-groups and out-groups. So again, this is a dictator game. You get as a participant, you get a certain amount of money. You can share it with a stranger as much as you like, or you can keep all of it, whatever you want. So in the trial now, for some people, they always played the game with the religious in-group. For other people, they always played the game with the religious out-group. So in the self perspective, you get a certain money, and then you say, well, there's another person of the same religion as you are. How much do you want to share with them? That's it. Then you get a second round and say, now you're going to also play with a different person of the same religion as you are, but now think about what God wants you to do in this situation. Or think from God's perspective. Depending on the study, we had different instructions. The instructions didn't matter. We got the same results. In the round, there's a typo here. So in the second and the bottom panel, it should be out-group, not in-group. Okay? Same thing, except now you're playing with a religious out-group. We thought, well, there are 4 different possibilities of what could happen when we do this study. Now, first, you would expect that, of course, people are going to favor the religious in-group and then the religious out-group, right, to begin with. And that's what we found. So that was the beginning point. Now, what happens when you think about God, and you're a believer, of course. So in this case, people were always believers. So basically, we're considering, on one extreme, it's possible that people are going to be very tribal. If God is very tribal in people's minds, then if I'm playing with an out-group member, I'm going to be even less likely to share with an out-group if I think about God, right? That would be the most tribal God kind of a situation. Strong parochiality. Weak parochiality would say that, well, I'm not going to exaggerate that difference if I think about God, but I'm going to give more to the in-group than to the out-group if I think about God. Right? A third possibility is that the weak universality is that I'm going to just ignore if someone is an in-group or out-group, I'm just going to give more. Okay? But if I just give equal amounts to both in-group and out-group members, you still have an in-group out-group difference, but I'm treating people fairly, at least in the sense of when I'm sharing more equally with in-groups and out-groups. And strong universality would be the other extreme where not only I share equally, but actually share more with an out-group member so that I can wipe out the in-group out-group difference. You can see how you can take a simple question, is religion a source of conflict or a source of peace? Like a broad question, but if you're a researcher and you want to try to really get at it, it gets really complicated. There are so many different possibilities, right? So these are the 4 possibilities that we considered. What were your guess? What happened? We got very consistent results. That's why I'm reporting it to you. I have lots of messy results. If you want me to share it with you, I can share it with you. I'm very happy. They're actually posted online, so you can find them yourself, but I can direct them to you. But I was surprised at the consistency of the results. And I was also wrong on many, many things, and I can tell you. For example, I thought that where there's places of conflict, the effect will be very tribal. I was wrong on that. So anyone wants to guess? You have, or at least you formulate your own guess, and I'll show you the results. Okay, here is the samples. We had large sample sizes, so we had reliable estimates of our effects. We had 3 samples in the USA, Christian, 2 samples of Christians, national samples, representative samples. In one case, the outgroup was atheist. In the other case, was a Muslim in the UAE. In the third sample, these were evangelical Christians who believe that many of them believe that they're at war. There's basically a war going on between Christianity and Islam. So we thought that was a really strong case of conflict, right? So evangelicals playing either with Muslims or playing with atheists. Atheists are also not, a fun group for evangelicals. And then we had Fiji, where there is a lot of religious tensions. So we had 3 studies in Fiji: Christians playing with Muslims, Hindus playing with Christians, Muslims with Christians. And finally, the mother of all conflicts, Middle East, West Bank, and Israel. We had Jewish Israelis, where they play a dictator game with Muslims in the West Bank, Muslim Palestinians, and Muslim Palestinians in the West Bank played with Jewish Israelis. Here are the results. As you can see, we found pretty consistently more giving after people thought about God or played the game from the God's perspective. So this is basically changing giving from self to God, right? So we're taking the difference score. And you can see in almost all cases, the bars are above 0, which means people are giving more when they think about God compared to they just play the game from the self perspective. And you can see that the size of the effect is same for in-group and out-group, more or less. Okay, so that supports the weak universality thesis, right? This is really hopeful. I was really, reassured seeing this. You might be wondering what's going on in Israeli Jewish and West Bank, and I can tell you what was going on there. Interestingly, there was a very strong in-groupishness in the West Bank Muslims and Palestinian Muslim and Israeli Jews. The in-groupishness, this is so basically now how much you can see the baseline of how much people gave the effect. So if the effect is going up, if the line is going up, that means that people are giving more after thinking about God, right? And the green line is in-group, the red line is out-group. And for the West Bank and the Israeli Jews, they were very in-groupish, so in-groupish that there was not a whole lot of room to give even more thinking about God. Because at some point, this effect tapers off. If you're giving a lot already, you're not going to give even more if you think about God. There are a few exceptions, though. In the case of Fijian Hindus, that happened, although in a small way. You can see the Fijian Hindus are so high on giving already to begin with. That was interesting. So, because of that, if anything, for the Palestinians and for the Jews, they actually gave more to the out-group after thinking about God than for the in-group. It's a bit of an anomaly, but it's kind of interesting. And you can see here also, another thing I wanted you to pay attention here that's super interesting is that at baseline, the in-group bias is still there. And after thinking about God, the in-group bias is preserved. So this kind of religious belief is not a panacea. It didn't completely eliminate the in-group bias, but it does show that religion has this effect of people are saying, God wants me to be nice to strangers, even if they're of a different religion. But up to a point, right? Okay, so religion and polarization. So throughout the years in thinking about this issue, I don't have a grand theory about this. I don't think anyone does, but it's a poorly researched topic. It'd be surprising given how important it is. But we found 3 things. One is that it seems like local religious ritual, but not religious belief, seems to be implicated in things like support for violent martyrdom. There is some evidence that commitment to moralizing gods sometimes leads to exclusion of non-believers. And third, circle of cooperation can extend to religious outgroups, but does not completely eliminate bias. So, wrapping things up, And now thinking more in terms of big picture of what's going on in the world today, 21st century, I think we have three challenges that we are facing as humanity, and there are these three big problems or challenges that I think religions are facing as well. One is religion versus religion, right? Religious conflict. And how do religions reimagine themselves so that religion doesn't become another dividing line, another accessory to conflict, and instead becomes a more a factor or a force to expand that social circle that I started with even more to all of humanity. There's also the question about secularism and religion. Like I said, secularism it is true that most of the world is still very religious, but secularism has become a big force in the world, 12 to 15% of the world. So that divide is also of a concern, and there needs to be more dialogue and more mutual understanding. And finally, and I think this is the least appreciated one, I think, is polarization. We often think of it in terms of human polarization, but there's also another polarization that's going on in the world, which is that we, for thousands of years, we humans have thought of ourselves as being separate from nature. And that is also polarization. And in the Abrahamic tradition, we see ourselves as the stewards of nature, or we have dominion over nature. Yet we become nature's biggest threat, right? And we need to do something about this. There is some hope, and I think religion is an important, and religious belief has an important role to play here. Way back in 1967, historian Leslie White wrote this very influential essay about this very topic. He could have written it last year. It's so contemporary, where he said what people do about their ecology depends on what they think about themselves in relation to things around them. Human ecology is deeply conditioned by beliefs about our nature and destiny, that is, by religion. And there have been stirrings recently about different leaders in different religious traditions where they're making this argument. So Pope Francis is famous for his encyclical basically encouraging Catholics to take care of the environment. Dalai Lama has said similar things about environment, and even a few years ago there was an Islamic declaration by many Islamic leaders where they also implored their followers to take better care of the planet. I think this is going to be a very important topic and movement that will be unfolding in the next few years, and I think we need to start paying more attention and trying to understand how we can leverage the power of religion to also increase our ability to live in a sustainable way. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, again for being here. Thank you, Dr. Norenzayan, once again for the wonderful talk. We have time for questions, and just a little plug, we have his book for sale outside, courtesy of the Wang Center, if any of you want to learn more about some of the things that were touched on in the talk. So we have a microphone, and please feel free to ask any questions you have of Dr. Norenzayan.
Thanks so much for coming. I wanted to go back about a half an hour to that one part about the Jewish man that shot up all the Muslims at prayer. And so I turned my head sideways and I looked at what it said there, and I saw that the basic number of people that approved of that was 15%. And then perhaps
you mean in the data here?
Right.
Yeah.
And so I just thought that was worth noting.
Right.
That 85% did not approve of his act.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If you could say anything about that, I'd be interested.
Nothing. I agree. Majority didn't see it as heroic, although he has a small but vocal followers. So, yeah. So, and what was interesting for us is that we could shift this percentage around by having people think about synagogue attendance or prayer.
I had a question. It's a curiosity. Your data showed fairly consistent support from the in-group to the out-group at all different, with some exceptions. Wondering the difference in perception of where that support is going, if it's going to people perceived as victims as opposed to people who are perceived as perpetrators. So in other words, if you have a conflict in a different part of the world, or even here in the US, and there's a group that could be a religious group or whatever that causes an event that is damaging, and people of that same group are adversely affected, hurt. Is there a difference between where that support would go to the people who are victims as opposed to perpetrators?
Can you clarify which particular study you were referring to? Or are you just asking a general question?
Well, generally I'm interested in the US, but I'm also intrigued by the information coming out of the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
I probably am not as aware of the Far East. That's my fault, but and then Central Europe, but primarily the US.
So the question is, does it matter if people see themselves as victims or perpetrators?
See, the group to where the support is going is whether it's going to the victims.
Oh, so if I have the opportunity to be generous or impartial with another outgroup member, if I see them as victims, would that change things? Okay, got it. Yeah, so in this particular, in those studies, we never really looked at that. That's a good question. I'm sure that would matter, yeah. So, yeah.
If you had a place of religious assembly,
Yeah.
and there was a large number of people there, and a splinter group or whatever of that group did a bombing, something like that, where you had families and children and everybody that were injured, or same ethnic or religious group, and there was an appeal for financial support or whatever support for that group, would that differ if it was perceived going to perpetrators or just the victims?
I agree with you that would be very important, and we didn't look at that in any of these studies, but if we did, I'm sure that would matter, yeah. Thank you.
Hi, so I'm interested in the difference between the data that you show, and there was a Harvard study in around 2010, I believe, along with Gallup, talking about how increased levels of participation in mosques in the United States actually show the higher the propensity of participation in mosque was a less likelihood to break any laws. And there's also the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding that shows a positive correlation between attendance at mosques for American Muslims and social participation in government and higher identification with the United States. So I'm kind of wondering about the difference in the data there.
Yeah, good question. So one thing I want to say is that where these are very different contexts. So in our studies, we had mosque attendance in the West Bank. This is a place where there is intense violent conflict between Palestinians and Israeli Jews. In the United States, you don't have that context, right? So I think that's really crucial. The other thing I'll say is that that might speak to your question. It's a great question. There have been some studies looking at ritual in a broader context. So there's a study by this economist, David Klingsmith, and his colleagues, where they looked at the effect of going to the Hajj by Muslims. I don't know, have you seen that study? And they did this really clever thing where, because one of the problems with doing a study like that, and you don't look to see people go to the Hajj and see what how their attitudes change, but then there's a selection problem, right? Chicken and egg problem. Like maybe people who are already think certain way go to the Hajj. So they took advantage of this lottery system in Pakistan, where people apply to go to the Hajj, to Mecca, but not everyone can go because there's too many people who want to go. So it's a lottery system. Some people get selected to go, others don't get to go. So they compared people who wanted to go, couldn't go, people who wanted to go and went. It's basically like as good as a random assignment, as we call it in research, right? Which eliminates differences in the tendency to want to go to the Hajj. And then they measured people's attitude, and they found that going to the Hajj actually made people more tolerant, more open to, more favorable towards women's rights, more also favorable to protecting minorities, etc. So it's interesting and does not, again, contradicts what I showed. But I think the difference here, again, is that, a global ritual is inherently a global experience, right? Whereas going to a local mosque, especially in a place of conflict, is a different experience. I think that's what's going on.
Right, because what you're talking about is actually engaging people who have some kind of difference from you, even if they would be. And I wonder if another way to frame the issue around in-group, out-group is whether or not the in-group, as part of an in-group, you perceive yourself and your in-group to be vulnerable or experiencing scarcity with respect to the other groups. And I think that's also an interesting conversation in a time of climate change.
Yeah.
When there's this sense of deep scarcity that is looming out there. And I wonder if that might be part of it, the in-group, out-group dynamic as well.
Hi,
Hi.
My name is Emery. Thank you for your time sharing your work. My question was about, I was wondering if you had more context to understanding like the distribution of money as altruism. So I was wondering about like the socio-cultural differences between the religious groups of seeing like the different religious group samples and their perception of kindness, like the idea of like donating money as altruism versus perhaps like letting like a stranger into your home as kindness, and how that plays with like the in-group, out-group dynamic.
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're right that that's a very crude way of measuring this underlying big variable. If we're measuring something like impartiality or fairness, but there are many ways of being impartial and fair and kind and compassionate, and we're not getting at any of those, right? So we're doing this one thing which is easy to do. I do want to say that it matters because it's, people in the studies want to keep the money. In many of these places, people actually, really appreciate having, we give them a day's wage in some of these places where we did the study. So we wanted people to really, to matter to them. We didn't want to just ask people, hey, are you kind with someone of a different religious group or a complete stranger? So that's why we did the money. The other advantage of doing the money is that we can standardize it across samples. If you don't do money, if you do different things in different cultures, that could be meaningful for that particular culture, but then you can't compare them. So it's a trade-off. So I totally, to my short answer to the question, great question. It's a limitation of these studies. Yeah, and we want to do more of those kinds of other things. Yeah.
Yeah, can I follow up? Can I ask another question? Yeah. Do you think it's really standard in terms of like the different groups' proximity to like how capitalism and works in different impacted groups? Like all those groups have different proximity to capitalism and like.
So what we did is if you're referring to that study that was done around the world where we had people could share money with a distant co-religionist, we made it equivalent by giving people a day's wage. Whatever the day's wage was in that culture, that's what they got to share. By the way, one place where we didn't use money was among the Hadza. The Hadza are a foraging group in Tanzania, and they don't have money. But they have honey sticks. So we did the game with honey sticks.
Hi there. My name's Eric. I'm in the religion department here. I've read your book. I really enjoyed it. In thinking about, it's sparked a lot of thoughts about a lot of things. As you mentioned, I think briefly in the book, the United States, in particular this region, is a place at a time where religious affiliation is just dropping off,
Yeah.
in huge numbers. But we're also facing a situation where, as a nation, we're having a decreasing willingness to trust government, so the social institutions, and decreasing willingness to pay taxes, right, to support people who we don't actually know directly, right? So your view from the north of us, what's going on with all that? Like, what do we do with all of that? Like, where are we headed? This is a very broad question, but I'm curious to hear your informed thoughts
That's
on that.
a big
Thank
question. Thanks for the question. U.S. is a fascinating place. It's a puzzle. Maybe if you live here, you don't notice that you're in a puzzle, but for social scientists, it's a puzzling place where there's high wealth, high religiosity, which is not atypical, strong institutions, but people don't trust the strong institutions. U.S. has the strong, America has the longest running constitution in the world, right? So it's like really strong institutions, but distrust of institutions. There's a book, isn't there a book on this? American Exceptionalism, I think it's called. I forget who wrote it. Sociologist wrote it. I think it's Walter Lipschitz, if I'm not wrong. So one thing that I can tell you, I don't think I can give you justice to your great question, and that's like we can talk about this for hours, but for a long time, it looked like the US was an outlier and religiosity levels were remaining high, despite all the trends, the worldwide trends. But recently, the data is coming out. In the last 5-6 years, several data papers have been published where you can see some evidence of secularization is catching up with the United States. So millennials, for example, are much less religious than their parents were at that age. So there's a great decline of religiosity also in the United States, as is happening in Canada and other places. What is unclear from the data is whether or not this is happening broadly all over the United States, or is it just concentrated in certain places. So I don't think there is much evidence of decline of religion among evangelicals, who are like 45% of the country, if I'm not mistaken, and not a whole lot of decline among African Americans. But the rest of the country, I think there's decline going on.
I'm Beth from the History Department, and I'm kind of piggybacking on what Eric said. If we broaden the scale of what we're thinking of as belief systems, and we think of the God of Fox News,
Okay.
I'm thinking of the fact that in such a media-driven society, people's
Yeah.
social experiences, the way they derive their moral understanding of the world and guide their actions accordingly, is often media-tied. So
Yeah.
I'm thinking that partly what we might be seeing in the US, I think we do recognize that we're weird, by the way. I won't speak for all the Americans in the room, but I think we do. Is this sense that I am being told by leaders how I should comport myself morally, who the in-group is, who the out-group is. I'm listening fairly exclusively to those voices. I think there's a religious aspect, broadening it in that scale, to what's going on within the US, and then some of those beliefs about the in-groups, the out-groups, and how you should behave morally. So your thoughts on that. But I think if we go beyond going to the synagogue, going to the mosque,
Yeah.
going to the church, to attending a ritual experience of listening to particular moral leaders through media, I see some parallels.
That's a great question that unfortunately, I don't know if I have anything intelligent to say about it, but you're right that, I mean, people are getting a lot of their moral ideas from certain, media sources. More than, I don't follow much of social media. I'm not on social media, but I know that a lot of people are, and there is this increasing bubble, as the panel was talking about in the morning, right? Where people select certain kinds of media sources and then they refuse to listen to anything else, And then there's this creation of people are living in social bubbles. And you're right that that's really important, and I didn't say much about that here.
Hi.
Hi.
I was just piggybacking off what my professor just asked. I was wondering if, like the government leaders in like the different countries might also have something to do with like the polarization between like religions, because I noticed like in India with Prime Minister Modi and his party, with like people speaking out so strongly against like Muslims, that just, I think it kind of leads into like more kind of, you know, violence against like that out group. And I was just kind of wondering, like, because even with here in the US, we've noticed like, I think I've noticed a lot stronger kind of unification of like the evangelicals and stuff with, you know, our Republican president. So I was just wondering what you thought about government leaders as also polarizing factors.
Yeah, no, great question. And I'm not a political scientist, but maybe some of you who are might have insights on this. I mean, are someone like Modi, so you were talking about this, the new discriminatory laws in India excluding Muslims from Indian citizenship. Is Modi a symptom or is he a cause, right? I don't, yeah. Or is it both?
Okay.
It's a great question.
I think that is all the time we have. Thank you again, everyone, for being here.
Thank you.